Today I made the Anvil from our creators. Let's get making. I downloaded this 3D model of the Anvil from Reprops off of Thingiverse, but I want my prop to light up and make noise, so I did some editing of the model and then sent it off to my 3D printer. While the Anvil prints, I get to work coding the lights and sound. So here's the code, but the real interesting stuff after you get through kind of the definitions and variables and stuff is down here, which is in the while loop. So I have this basically detects the trigger, and then right now I have it printing just so I could debug it a little bit. Here's where most of the actual fun stuff's going on. We have an if statement that detects the trigger, and if the sound has not been played, so sound played equals false, which is down here, which basically tells if the sound has been played, and if it has, then it doesn't let it play again until the trigger has been unpressed, which prevents you from just holding down the trigger and the sound constantly playing. So once it gets through that, it adds trigger count +1, which is then called into down here for these two statements, which is if the trigger count is more than 3 or more than 4, respectively. If the trigger count is more than 3 and sound played is false and random sound count is equal to 3, then a shield break sound will play. If all this is true, then a flare sound will play. I gave this a 1 and a 20% chance for either one of those sounds to play, as long as the trigger count is at the respective variables. With the code complete, I move on to the part of the Anvil that is going to snap on with magnets. I'm adding this so I can easily access the battery. However, the holes I added for the magnets to sit in were a bit too small, so I had to use my drill to widen them. Here's the trigger mechanism, which took 2 attempts to get right. Once everything is wired up, the trigger will press a button to activate the lights and sound. As you can see here, this side of the Anvil came off my printer pretty rough. In order to fix this and smooth out the rest of the prop, I'm going to first sand everything down using 120 grit sandpaper, and then paint on a mixture of red spot putty and acetone. I make sure to apply the spot putty heavier in the rougher parts to really fill in the gaps. I then thin down the putty with more acetone and apply it over the rest of the Anvil. Once dried, I return to sanding, this time using 220 grit. Now, if you do the same process with your 3D printed props, make sure to wear a respirator, as the spot putty comes off as a really fine red dust, and I'm fairly confident you don't want it in your lungs. And look at that finish, super smooth. To make the Anvil just a little bit smoother and to prime it for painting, I hit it with a filler primer. With all that out of the way, I move on to the electronics. I first pre-solder all the headers that I will be using. With each component pre-soldered, I hot glue each of them in place and then connect everything together. I then plug the battery in for the test and push the button, and nothing. After a bit of troubleshooting, I rewire the button and replace the LED strip, and it works. With all the electronics done, I glue the magnets in place and paint the trigger piece. I hand paint this piece with watered down paint to reduce thickness. If I apply too much paint, it may gum up the trigger mechanism. Now I'll set the trigger in place and use super glue to permanently connect the two halves of the Anvil together. Off camera, I hit the Anvil with silver spray paint. Here, I'm applying a watered down dark silver paint to muddy up the color of the Anvil. I apply the paint haphazardly, dapping some areas of excess paint off and leaving more in other areas to achieve an uneven paint job. This will help the Anvil look worn and used. After the dark silver had dried, I sprayed the whole Anvil down with a matte clear coat to lock all the paint in place. Next, I break out my airbrush and add black paint to darken up some of the areas of the Anvil. I'm aiming to paint the black onto areas that would collect dust, so any recesses or gaps. I also apply some at the end of the Anvil to give it a burned look. After the black coat had dried, I painted on some brown and a reddish brown to create a rust effect. Now to finish the Anvil up and to lock the black and rust color in place, I hit the whole thing again with another matte clear coat. And with the final clear coat dried, the Anvil is complete.